That's what this video is about. Because after years of working as a psychologist and watching how people's relationships with food affect their mental health, I've seen something the fasting community rarely discusses openly. Fasting, done thoughtlessly, can cause real psychological damage, and the warning signs are subtle enough that most people don't notice until they are already in trouble. By the end of this video, you'll understand what the science actually says about fasting and mental health, including what it can genuinely help with, and you'll know exactly what to watch out for in yourself. I'm Sergey Upapavisai, licensed psychologist based in Munich. Let's get into it. First, let's be honest about what the research actually shows, because it's more nuanced than either the fasting advocates or the critics want to admit. A 2023 systematic review of 15 randomized controlled trials found that intermittent fasting produced small to moderate reductions in depressive symptoms without major adverse effects in generally healthy adults. A separate study published in 2025 using brain imaging technology found that intermittent fasting reduced anxiety levels by changing the functional connectivity of the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. These are meaningful findings. At the neurobiological level, there are real mechanisms behind these benefits. When you fast, your body shifts from burning glucose to producing ketones, specifically a molecule called beta-hydroxybutyrate. This molecule crosses the blood-brain barrier and functions as a neuronal fuel source. It also inhibits certain enzymes linked to inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain. Animal studies show that intermittent fasting increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which supports the growth of new neurons and is consistently associated with better mood and resilience. Fasting also appears to recalibrate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs how we respond to stress. So yes, done correctly, by the right person, fasting can have genuine psychological benefits. But here is what the same body of research also shows. A 2024 scoping review found that prolonged fasting, more than 7 days, can increase neuroinflammatory markers including interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, raising real concerns for people with existing psychiatric vulnerabilities. Case reports document affective instability, spikes in anxiety, and in vulnerable individuals, the triggering or worsening of mood episodes, and the psychological risk of fasting go far beyond these physiological effects. This is the part nobody talks about enough. There is a psychological territory that lies between healthy fasting and an eating disorder, and it is much larger than most people realize. Most people who end up in that territory don't see themselves as having a problem. They see themselves as being disciplined. Psychologists call the most relevant pattern orthorexia, an increasingly recognized condition defined by an obsessive fixation on eating in a way the person defines as pure, clean, or correct. Orthorexia is not yet formally classified as an eating disorder in the main diagnostic manuals, but research consistently shows it causes real distress and functional impairment. And a 2023 study identified fasting behavior as a significant risk factor for both orthorexia and eating disorders, with orthorexia fully mediating the relationship between fasting and clinical eating disorders. In other words, for some people, fasting is the gateway. The pathway looks like this. Someone starts fasting for genuinely reasonable health reasons. They feel better initially. The structure feels good, knowing exactly when they can eat, having clear rules. Over time, the eating window becomes a source of identity. Breaking it starts to feel like failure. The window gets shorter. Exceptions become harder to tolerate. The person begins organizing their social life around their fasting schedule. They feel anxious at events where food is present outside the window. They feel guilty when they eat early. They feel proud, even superior, when they don't. And slowly, without a single dramatic turning point, what started as a health practice has become a psychological cage. Let me be specific about the warning signs, because this is the most practically useful part of this video. The first warning sign is rule rigidity that escalates over time. Healthy fasting has flexibility built in. If you are unable to be flexible without significant distress, if breaking your fast window even once genuinely ruins your day emotionally, that rigidity is worth examining. Research on orthorexia consistently identifies escalating restriction as one of the core early indicators. The second warning sign is food preoccupation outside eating windows. Some degree of thinking about food when hungry is normal and biological. But if you are spending significant mental energy planning, counting down to, or thinking obsessively about food during fasting periods, if it interferes with your ability to concentrate on work, conversations, or life, that cognitive intrusion is a signal. Your nervous system is not at rest with this practice. It is under chronic stress. The third warning sign is social withdrawal organized around food. If you are regularly declining invitations, skipping family meals, or engineering your social life to avoid situations where you might be expected to eat outside your window, that is a significant red flag. A healthy relationship with food expands your life. A problematic one contracts it. The research is consistent. Social isolation to protect eating rules is one of the clearest behavioral markers of a developing eating disorder pattern. The fourth warning sign is emotional regulation through fasting. This is subtle but important. Fasting, like any restrictive practice, can become a way of managing emotions that have nothing to do with food. The control feels good when other areas of life feel chaotic. The hunger can be a distraction from psychological pain. The rules provide a sense of order when the internal world is disordered. If you notice that you feel calmer, safer, or more in control when fasting strictly, and anxious, destabilized, or ashamed when you don't, pay attention to that. You may be using food restriction as an emotional regulation tool rather than a health practice. The fifth warning sign is the binger strict cycle. Research published in 2025 found that restrictive dieting, particularly in people with higher impulsivity, consistently increased binge eating behavior. This is not a failure of willpower. It is a neurobiological response to deprivation. When the body is restricted beyond its tolerance, the drive to eat becomes physiologically overwhelming, and the psychological experience of this, followed by shame and return to restriction, is the hallmark of a destructive eating cycle. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, fasting in its current form is actively harming you. Now I want to address something that's specific to the psychological dimension of fasting, the identity piece, because this is where I see the most damage in my clinical work. Food and identity have always been intertwined in human psychology. What we eat is connected to who we think we are. But when fasting becomes an identity, when I am someone who fasts becomes central to your self-concept, you have created a situation where eating is not just a biological act but a threat to your sense of self. This is dangerous for several reasons. First, it makes the practice extremely difficult to modify or stop, even when evidence suggests you should. Second, it means that lapses, which are inevitable for any human being over the long term, are experienced not as normal fluctuations but as failures of character. And shame, as we know from research by Kristen Neff and others, is one of the most reliably destructive psychological experiences we can have. It doesn't motivate change, it undermines it. Third, and most importantly, when a dietary practice becomes identity, you stop being able to evaluate it clearly. People who would otherwise think critically about health information stop being able to apply that critical thinking to their own fasting practice, because questioning the practice means questioning who they are. If this resonates at all, if you noticed any recognition as I described it, that recognition is important, not as a condemnation, as information. Here is what not to do. Do not fast if you have a current or historical eating disorder without explicit guidance from a clinician who knows your full picture. The research on this is unambiguous. Restriction, even structured, intentional restriction, is one of the most reliable triggers for eating disorder relapse. Do not use extended fasting as a first-line approach to emotional regulation, stress management, or mood improvement. These are the exact conditions that make the psychological risks highest. If your life is currently stressful or emotionally difficult, your nervous system needs nourishment and stability, not restriction. Do not escalate. If you're doing 16/8 and thinking about moving to 24-hour fasts and then to multi-day fasts, ask yourself honestly, is this driven by genuine evidence that it's working for me, or by something else? Escalating restriction is one of the clearest behavioral patterns associated with disordered eating. Do not fast in isolation from the rest of your relationship with food. Fasting is one tool. It exists within a broader pattern of how you eat, how you think about food, how you feel about your body, and how you relate to hunger. If those other elements of your relationship with food are already strained, fasting will amplify that strain, not resolve it. And finally, do not confuse discipline with control. Discipline is a tool you use to serve your well-being. Control is what happens when the tool starts using you. What should you do instead? If you want to practice fasting in a psychologically healthy way, the research supports the following principles. Start conservatively and watch your response honestly, not just your physical response, but your psychological one. How do you feel emotionally on fasting days? How does flexibility feel? Can you adapt without distress when circumstances require it? Keep social eating in your life. Meals shared with people you care about are psychologically significant. They connect food to relationship and pleasure rather than to rules and performance. Protect that. If you notice any of the warning signs I described, and I want to emphasize any of them, take that seriously, not as shame, as information that something needs to be looked at more carefully. And if you are genuinely unsure whether your relationship with food and fasting is healthy, consider speaking with a psychologist or a registered dietitian who specializes in eating behavior, not because something is necessarily wrong, but because having a clear, honest outside perspective on something this central to your daily life is always valuable. Fasting can be a genuinely useful practice. The research supports that clearly, but it is not a neutral practice, and it does not operate in a psychological vacuum. Your relationship with restriction, with hunger, with control, with your own body, these things matter. They shape what fasting does to you far more than the specific eating window you choose. Take care of the psychological dimension of this as carefully as you take care of the physical one. I'm Sergiu Popovicai, licensed psychologist based in Munich. If you want to work through any of what came up for you in this video, I offer consultations in Munich and online. The link is in the description. Subscribe for weekly psychology content that actually tries to be useful. And I'll see you in the next one.